Hello and welcome to vVork. I'm Brian Watrous. This is the second in a two-part video series. I'll provide a link to the first video in the description down below. In this video series, I'm taking a look at modular programming and how they pertain to PowerCLI and in particular VRO. And what I wanted to do in this particular second part is to show you a real-life example of doing Orchestrator development in which I'm employing some of the modular programming techniques that I talked about in the previous video. So let's actually jump over into the lab environment and take a look. All right, as you can see here, I'm already logged into the vRealize Orchestrator client. I've gone to Design View. I've selected the Workflows tab, and I'm going to right-click my folder and create a new workflow. I'll name my workflow. Not a terribly original name, but good enough for our purposes. And now that I'm in editing mode, I'm going to go to the General tab, and I'm going to type a description. Part of what makes it possible to do modular programming in Orchestrator is strictly adhering to the following mandate: thou shalt type descriptions. So I'm going to type a description here. This particular workflow that I'm creating is not all that exciting, so it's not going to say that much here, but I'll give you a more general description of what you would use this field for in a moment. So let's see here. This workflow creates a virtual machine. Now that is a obviously very simple description. A more useful description would obviously go into more details, but it would also perhaps mention things such as any preconditions or postconditions of this workflow. So for instance, for this workflow to work, I would need to have a vSphere environment set up. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to do anything for me. Now I'm going to jump over next to this Schema tab. And here in the Schema tab, you can see my schema. It has a start element and an end element. And what I'm going to do is drag out a workflow element. What that does is it calls somebody else's workflow. So let me drag that out. I'm going to drag it and drop it on the arrow between the start and end. And a little window pops up. And in that window, I can type a portion of whatever it is I'm looking for. I'm looking for a workflow called, here it is, Create Simple Virtual Machine. Now, as I click on this workflow, that's a workflow that somebody else wrote. And notice that they have been kind enough to type a description. So their description says that their workflow is going to create a virtual machine with the most common devices and configuration options. Now, again, if you think that's a sufficient description, then maybe that's what your descriptions will look like. I, on the other hand, generally try to write descriptions that provide enough detail that whoever's calling my workflow is going to know what information they need to make effective use of the workflow that I'm writing. But that's a reasonable description. I'll go ahead and select it. So I clicked once to get that little pop-up to actually select this workflow. I'm going to double-click it. As you can see within my schema, I now have a schema element to call his workflow. And the first thing I'm going to do, the first thing I always do, is I am going to edit the workflow. And then either looking at the in-out tabs or the visual binding tab, or in the previous video I mentioned something called the setup wizard. This is it. But I usually go for the visual binding tab. Any of those three ways will allow me to set up variable binding, but I go to the visual binding tab because it provides me a real quick, succinct view of what the contract is that I have to satisfy in order to use this workflow that I'm trying to call. So in the center section here, we have all the information about this workflow that we're attempting to call. If I want to call that workflow, I have to hook up his variables to variables within my own workflow. That's what these outer columns are about. These are my input parameters and attributes, as opposed to over on the right side, these are my output parameters and attributes of my workflow. So the outside columns are my variables. The inside part is his variables. What I'm going to do with each of these is I'm going to hook them up by simply clicking on this here triangle for this first guy, and I will drag it into one of these two sections. I'll explain in a little bit how I'm deciding which to do. But this first variable is simple. It's called vmName. It's a string. I'm going to click and drag it and drop it in this white space. Eventually, I'll probably run out of white space. So anytime I want, whether I have white space or not, I can drop on the column headers. But I've got plenty of white space here. I'm going to click, drag, and drop, and a window pops up. What that window is doing is it's allowing me to create a new variable in my workflow. I'm not allowed to change his variables. I can't change their name, I can't change their type, but I can change the name of my variable. So this part here that's highlighted is the name that's going to be used to create my variable. If I don't like that name, I can change it. For instance, maybe I'd rather spell out the variable name. So my variable name and his variable name don't have to match. Sometimes it's useful to have them match, other times it's not. But whatever works for you, you can use your own name or use the default. Same thing with the description. The description that I see here for my variable is going to be the exact same as his description. But if I want to, I can change it. Now in some contexts, it's going to be possible to change the type or the number of this variable that I'm creating. But whenever you're doing variable binding, when you're connecting your variable to his variable, your variable has to match his type and his quantity. That's why this section's grayed out, because I don't get the choice. My variable has to match his. Here I don't have a choice. Sometimes you'll see the choices of input parameter and attribute. Here I don't see the choice of input parameter versus attribute because when I dragged and dropped, I said I want an input parameter, not an attribute, but an input parameter. So that's nothing going on there. Here, where it asks me for a value, it says, hey, you can't do that because the whole point of an input parameter is rather than have the Orchestrator developer set the value of a particular variable, the end user who's calling your workflow is going to set the value. Now, strictly speaking, it doesn't have to be a human being that's calling your workflow. It might be another workflow that's calling your workflow, or the workflow scheduler calling your workflow, or it could be an external system calling your workflow. To keep the language simple, though, I'll keep talking about it as if it's a person calling your workflow. So since we set an input parameter, we're going to ask the person calling our workflow to supply the name of the VM. So I'll click OK. And let's go to the next variable, or next input parameter. This one here is, oh, the name got truncated. Well, while you'll be tempted to use these column resizing handles to see what you can't see, there's a much easier way. Just select the variable, and down below it gives you detailed information about the variable. It tells you its full name, tells you its type. Don't worry about what a VC: virtual machine guest OS identifier is. If you want to know about that, talk to me in class or watch some of my other videos. But that's just the type of the variable. It could be a string, it could be a number, it could be a Boolean. This happens to be a much more complex object type. And then there's a description. Now again, because the person that wrote the workflow I'm calling has done a good job of typing a good variable name and a good description, I have a pretty darn good idea of what this variable is about. By the way, you can also see the description if you just let the tooltip pop up. So what it wants us to do here is to supply information about what kind of guest operating system we are going to install in this virtual machine. Now rather than set this up as a input parameter, which would give the user complete control, I'm going to set this next one up as an attribute. I do so just by clicking and dragging to the lower left-hand corner to the attribute section. And again, the window that pops up is going to work much the same way. Before I explain everything I'm setting up here, I'd just like to say in general that if you trust the user and you think the user is smart enough to answer the question that's being asked, then you set that up as an input parameter. But if you don't think the user is smart enough to answer a question, if they don't know, for instance, what a VM NB of CPU is, if you don't think the user knows what you're asking for, or you don't trust the user to answer the question, that's when you set up something called an attribute. So for all the rest of these, I'm going to set them up as attributes. And for all the rest of these, I'm going to go with the default name, default description, default type, because I can't change that anyways. I'm going to go with the attribute for all of them. All I'm going to focus on these next ones is setting their values. So if I click on Not Set, again, we get a little window popping up that lets me type what I'm looking for. For instance, maybe I want to install DOS, so I type DOS and DOS comes up. Or if you don't know what to type there, you can always just hit enter in that field and it will show you everything. But I'm going to choose DOS guest by double clicking it. And then let's go to another easy parameter. This one here called VM num of CPUs. We're going to set that up as an attribute, and as you've probably already guessed by the name or its description, this just allows us to specify how many virtual machines we want the new VM to have. I'm going to say one VM. And notice, since this is an attribute, the user no longer gets a choice. He's going to get a 1 vCPU VM. Let's do the same thing for memory. So I'm setting up memory as a attribute. Thank goodness the person that wrote the workflow we're calling specified in the description what the granularity is here. So the number I'm typing is megabytes. I'm going to do the same thing for the disk size. Again, he's been kind enough to tell me he's talking in gigabytes, so I'll create a 100 gigabyte disk. I don't actually have that much space in my lab environment, so I'm going to use this disk thin provision variable to turn on thin provisioning. Take a vSphere class if you don't know about thin provisioning. The short answer is it's a more disk space efficient way. Anyways, so those are all pretty simple. The rest of these get a little more complicated. As you can see, they involve these more complicated object types such as vc::vm folder and vc::resource pool. Again, in the classroom environment, I can go into much more detail about what these are, but let me get the ball rolling here. One of the things we need to specify is what VM folder we want the new VM to land in. Now, let me actually close here for a moment so that I can switch over to the vSphere web client. I'm logged into the vSphere web client. I'm in the VMs and templates view, and I just want to point out that I don't actually have any VM folders currently. I have my vCenter server, I have my data center, and a couple of VMs, but no VM folder. Or at least it doesn't appear that I do. In reality, you do. In reality, I do. In reality, everyone who's got a host has, or a vCenter server, everyone's got a VM folder. You just don't see it. So let me go back into editing. I'm going to bind a new variable for my VM folder. And when I set the VM folder's value, I'll go through the vCenter plugin, through my vCenter server, through the data center folder called data centers, through my data center called vvork. And notice I do have a VM folder. It's called VM, but it doesn't show up over in the vSphere web client. These 4 folders exist in your vCenter server, but your vSphere web client and tools like that hide them from you. In fact, they also hide this data centers folder from you. But in the case of each of these will act as sort of the root of all the VM folders that I might want to create. So again, let me bomb out of here, flip back over to the vSphere web client. If I create a new VM folder, I'll call this one my VM folder just to make it obvious. If I do create a new VM folder, okay, it's doing it, there it is. So here's this new VM folder. There's nothing actually in it. These guys are not in it. If they were, they'd be indented further. So I've got this new VM folder. And notice back over here in Orchestrator, once again, let's set up that variable. Actually, I already have the binding. A little trick here. I'm going to right click and choose edit so that I can change its value. So if I go drilling down again through the vCenter plugin, notice now in the VM folder, you can see my folder that I created. So this one up top here called VM is created for you by default, but it's hidden by the vSphere web client. But I could choose either of these, whether it's a VM folder I created or it's the one that's automatically created, either will work. To show that I can stick it in any folder I want, I'm going to choose my VM folder. And I'm going to continue onwards with the rest of these pretty quickly here. One thing I would like to point out, it's fine to right click here and choose edit. It's fine to right click here and choose edit. It's fine to right click in this area or this area and choose edit. But I would encourage you to avoid right clicking any of these variables in the middle and choosing edit. If you want to know why, talk to me offline and I'll let you know. In the meantime, so let's set up the other variables. So VM host, this is the host that the VM is going to run on. I'm going to drill my way down through the tree again. By the way, if you're getting sick and tired of the tree, it's possible in Orchestrator to change which method we use to get information from the user. For instance, right now I'm using the tree browser, but if I wanted to, instead of using the tree browser where you see every stinking object in the universe, we can instead, by setting up something called input parameter presentation, we can set up the interface so that it instead just gives us a drop-down list of hosts or a drop-down list of virtual machine folders or so forth. If you want to know more about that, read about input parameter presentation or join me in class. Continuing onwards here. All right, resource pool. Let's set which resource pool. So for resource pool, again, I'm just going to drill down real quickly. Once again, I haven't created any resource pools, but there automatically is a resource pool that gets created for you. Whether that's a resource pool for your cluster, which I don't have in this environment, or a standalone host like I have here, there's always a resource pool created called resources. And if you create any of your own resource pools, they'll show up as sub-resource pools. All right, so I choose the resource pool, click OK. And the last two here are pretty straightforward. I'm just going to pick which network I want the VM plugged into. So drill my way down. Let's see, the network I only have one, so I'll pick it. And data stores I actually have to be a little more careful of, because notice I've run out of white space, so I'm going to drop on the column header. Data store I'm going to be a little careful with because my hosts are currently set up as standalone hosts. I have no shared storage between them, so I've got to make certain I pick the right data store to go with the right host. So under data stores, I picked host ESXi01. I happen to know that data store 1 in my environment is a local data store on that host. Anyways, I choose that, and now we've hooked up all the input parameters to the workflow that we're calling, which you have to do. You have to bind all of these. If nothing else, you have to bind them to something called null. Now, I've actually bound them all. I didn't bind to null. If you want to know about binding to null, join me in the classroom, or look at my other vVork videos. In the meantime, over here on the right side, we have the output parameters of the workflow that we're calling. And while you certainly could create an output parameter, it's in general, as a new Orchestrator developer, it's going to be better to create attributes. Again, I can talk with you offline or other videos in the classroom about why that is, but in general, as a beginning Orchestrator developer, you might want to develop the habit whenever you think something should be an output parameter, bind it as an attribute instead. All right, so new VM, let's set its value. Actually, in this case, I'm not going to bother setting the value of this newly created variable because the workflow that I'm calling is going to set the value of that variable. That's not one thing about these attributes is while many cases you will set the value of the attributes, in some cases you won't. In some cases, you're going to have the values set programmatically. All right, so I'm going to say OK. Looks like we've got a good looking workflow here. Let me validate it. Looks like it's valid. Let's run it. Notice because my workflow only had one input parameter, the person who's calling this workflow is only being asked one question. My new VM. Let's submit the workflow. All the other questions that would have otherwise been asked have been set up as attributes, so they're not asked here. We only see input parameters here. So we run the workflow, and that lovely green shading that you see going on is letting us know where we are in the workflow, and look at that, we're done with the workflow. And we can tell that it completed successfully because it says completed here. And furthermore, if we go over, drumroll please, if we go over into the vSphere web client and perhaps do a refresh, if we look in my VM folder, you'll see I now have a newly created VM called my new VM. So that, again, is a demonstration of how I used in Orchestrator something called a workflow called Create Simple Virtual Machine. And that workflow is an example. It doesn't jump out and scream at you, I'm a black box, but that's an example of the black box methodology in the world of Orchestrator. Okay, so that's all I plan to demo here. Again, if you have interest in learning more about this, check out my other videos at vvork.info or sign up for class. If you want to join me in the classroom environment, I promise I'll learn you lots of good things. If you want to sign up for class, go to www.vmware.com/education, search for a class on Orchestrator, and join me in the classroom. Thanks, everyone.